Welcome back, Digital Seekers. Today we are going to talk about WSL2, Windows Subsystem for Linux version 2. This is actually a thin layer of virtualization on top of Windows, using which you can run multiple Linux distributions of your choice, either simultaneously or individually. Until now, when we have to run multiple operating systems on a single machine, single hardware, we used to have multi-boot or dual boot operating systems. That means on a single hardware, you are going to install multiple operating systems and you will select which operating system you want to boot into during the booting time. This has a serious limitation because every time when you boot in, you have to actually select a particular operating system, and when you are inside Linux, you cannot really access your Windows, and when you are inside Windows, you cannot really access your Linux. And also these operating systems are using their own partitions or their own disks, and you don't want to really touch the other hard disk while you are actually using the current operating system. That means when you are running your Linux operating system, you don't really want to touch your C drive wherein your Windows operating system is installed. Why? Because by doing so, you might corrupt the Windows operating system that might never boot. So these are serious limitations, and in case of a multi-boot operating system or a dual boot operating system, you cannot have complete cohesive experience. So in this session, we are going to talk about WSL2, what it is, and what should really motivate you or prompt you to install WSL2. And then we are going to talk about the differences between virtual machines and WSL2, and what are the minimum hardware requirements for running WSL2. And then we will talk about do I need Docker, if I want Docker, and then how I have to install it. If I want to run Docker inside my Linux distribution and also in Windows, how can I communicate between these two Docker engines? And then we are going to talk about key issues or key concerns that you will face when you're actually setting up your WSL2 development environment, and the remedies for those issues. And finally, we are going to talk about Windows Terminal, which is going to help you organize your multiple Linux distributions in one single command window. So let us just jump right in. Let us first talk about our first topic, what is WSL2 and what should really prompt you to install. So basically, when you look at any new technology, the first question that comes to your mind is, do I really need it? So what should really prompt me to install WSL2 or this new technology? So let us say you are a developer who are interested in brushing up your Linux command skills, or you are well versed with Linux and then you actually want to run Linux commands in your Windows environment. Then your best choice would be to go for Cygwin. So Cygwin is a open source utility. You can actually install it in Windows, and it will come with all goodies of Linux, and all commands of Linux will actually work, almost all of them. And then you can actually run Windows commands parallel to your Linux commands, which is the beauty of Cygwin. And if not, I mean, if you are just willing to run some few commands in Linux, say your find grep commands, which are actually very handy, then you might want to use git bash, because if you are a developer and then if you have checked in code into git repositories, you might already know git is actually a versioning system. So when you install git in Windows, it already comes with git bash. So using git bash, you can run commands, not only git commands, but also find and grep commands you can run. If not, so another option for you is actually to go for a Linux virtual machine. That means you can actually install Oracle VirtualBox and install Linux virtual machine inside your Oracle VirtualBox, and you can have all the goodies because it is coming with complete kernel. So you have the complete flexibility. You can as well install software within Linux, and you can do everything inside your Linux environment. Whereas in Cygwin, you cannot install Apache or some other software inside your Cygwin environment. Whereas in a Linux virtual machine, you can do everything. The other alternative is to go for WSL2. So WSL2, as I said, is a thin layer of virtualization. So using which you can actually set up your Linux distribution on top of Windows, and you can parallelly work with Windows and Linux. So if you are looking for a full-fledged Linux full stack development, or Linux first development stacks is what you are actually looking at in your development experience, then you are actually looking for a Linux virtual machine. So in those cases, it is good that you actually go for WSL2 over your Linux virtual machine. Now that we have talked about do I need WSL2 and what should prompt me to install WSL2, let us just quickly look at the differences between virtualization and WSL2. So I don't really want to go into detail about virtualization because I have a detailed video wherein I have talked about various levels of virtualization, the history of virtualization, where it has started, where it is now, and Docker and all of that in one of my previous videos. I'll provide a link to that video. Please go through that to understand virtualization at length. So let us say you actually have a virtual machine and you have WSL2. So why should I choose WSL2 or virtual machine? Because when you're using a virtual machine, you're actually giving a dedicated hardware like your hard disk, RAM, CPU cycles, you're actually dedicating to your virtual machine, and then you're actually starting it. So as long as the virtual machine is running, all your hardware is occupied. So you cannot use that hardware parallelly with your Windows operating. Whereas when you're using WSL2, as I said, it is a thin layer of virtualization. So you can actually share your hardware resources like your RAM, hard disk, and CPU cycles across your distributions, Linux distributions, and also Windows. That means you can run programs, and if the programs you are running are actually mutually exclusive, then they can share these hardware resources. That is the beauty of WSL2. Another major difference is when you are using a Linux virtual machine inside Windows, you're actually creating a virtual hard disk for your Linux, and you cannot interoperate between a Linux hard disk and your Windows hard disks. You have to actually create shared folders. Again, there will be conflicts on symbolic links, and there will be many issues. So when you're using a virtual machine, you have the limitations of sharing files between your host operating system and your Linux distribution. Whereas when you're actually using WSL2, so both WSL2 and Windows are actually looking at the same hard disks, and you can interoperate between these two operating systems or multiple operating systems that you have installed using WSL2. So with this discussion, we have already covered do I need WSL2, Cygwin, JitBash, WSL2, virtual machines, and differences between virtual machine and WSL2. So two major differences we have discussed, and these two major differences are sufficient enough to actually go for WSL2 over a virtual machine. So the next up is what are the minimum configurations required for the system to run WSL2. So Windows has a predefined, requirements for running WSL2. In the previous discussion, we have so far covered, we are going for WSL2 or a virtual machine when you're actually looking for Linux first development stack. That means you are going to have some Apache kind of servers running, and then you have your development environment running with Node.js, Python, or some kind of open source software, something like that. So it is advisable for your virtual environment to have a minimum of 5 GB of RAM, and your operating system, Windows operating system, would require another 3 to 5 GB of RAM. So overall, if your machine is having at least 8 GB of RAM, so it is barely sufficient for you to run your WSL2. And on top of that, you might want to have your Apache servers running while you're actually doing something inside your Windows. So, or your Python engine running, or your Node.js engine running. So you have multiple microservices running using Docker, something like that. If you have such a complex environment, it is better to have enough number of cores to deal with such load. So it is better to have minimum quad core on your system, or dual core with 4 threads is going to be okay. So quad core is going to be the best for a developer experience to have WSL2. So what we are saying is you better have a quad core processor with 8 to 10 GB of RAM as minimum. So then you're good to go for WSL2 and the fabulous development experience using WSL2 inside Windows. So now let us just talk about how to install WSL2. Windows Subsystem for Linux installation has two different approaches. One is simplified installation, and second one is manual installation. For doing simplified installation, you actually need to have registered for Windows Insider program. So you have to register there, and then afterwards the installation process is going to be quite simple. You just need to run WSL -install, and then your installation is complete for WSL. I personally didn't join Windows Insider program. I rather install it using manual process, but even the manual process is not going to be too complicated. So in case of a manual process, the first thing is you have to actually enable Windows subsystem for Linux. So this you can run by using this you can do it by using the PowerShell command. So the command is also given here. So you can just run this command inside a PowerShell window, and then you're actually enabling Windows subsystem for Linux. And after that, you have to actually check requirements for running WSL2. So we already said that we need at least 8 GB of RAM, and then quad core or dual core with 4 threads is okay. And on top of that, you also have requirements that you need to have a 64-bit operating system, and then you need to have minimum build requirements on Windows 10. So what I would suggest is go ahead and then update all the latest latest and greatest builds which are coming from Windows, and you are up to the mark. And then you have to enable virtual machine features. So hoping that you have already used virtual machines or Oracle VirtualBox or VMware inside your hardware inside your machine. So you'd have already enabled virtualization in BIOS. So if not, you can do it in BIOS, or you can as well run these PowerShell commands to actually enable virtualization in your machine. The next step is actually to download and install Linux update package, Linux kernel update package. So this is going to enable running Linux kernels inside your Windows operating system. So you can download and install that. So I already did it. So next thing is set WSL2 as your default version. WSL is coming in two flavors, WS version 1 and WS version 2. So you have to make WSL2 as your default version. So that you can do by running WSL set default version 2 inside a PowerShell window, and then installing your Linux distribution of choice. So the next step is actually to install your favorite Linux distribution. I have gone for Ubuntu, and you can install multiple versions of Linux as well. So we have Ubuntu, OpenSUSE Leap, and then we have SUSE Linux, and then you have Debian, and you have Kali Linux. So you have multiple variations of these Linux distributions. So you can choose whichever Linux distribution is your favorite, and then you can actually go for it. And as I said, you can as well install multiple versions of Linux distribution, no issue. So you can simply select that distribution and then install it, and you're done. So with this, your WSL2 setup is done, and then you have already installed your Linux distribution. So after this, you can as well set up your Ubuntu as your default WSL2 configuration, and then it will automatically start your Ubuntu as or your favorite Linux distribution as your default Linux kernel as soon as WSL2 starts. So subsequently, once you have installed WSL2 on your favorite Linux distribution, the next step is actually to connect to that command shell. Why? Because Linux, we are not installing the graphical user interface. You are only going to install Linux command line interface. So for that, you need to have command prompt, and then you should be able to reach out to that command shell. So for that, it is better to install Windows Terminal, because Windows Terminal is a very beautiful application which came out from Windows, and which is a gift for developers, I would say, which is a free tool from Microsoft, and I started using it and I started loving it. The reason behind is I can actually start a Windows terminal in my default configuration. So as you can see, the moment I started my Windows terminal, I configured it that way. I'm going to show you how you can do that. So it actually started with my Linux Ubuntu distribution on the left, and then I have my PowerShell coming right up here, and then I have my command prompt coming up right here. So I am working on responsive images, my project, so I can directly start in that particular folder, so that I don't really need to do a command, CD every time I open my command shell. This is my pre-cooked development screen that I want the moment I logged in, right? So, and also it can have multiple tabs. So as you can see, I have another tab which is actually helping me to connect to my Janus graph. So I'm actually using Janus graph database in my setup and for my project, and I can directly connect to my Janus graph directly by coming into this window. So the whole thing is started at once when I started my WSL2 terminal. So what you would have observed is I can have multiple windows running on top of a single screen. So I can split it by using hotkeys. So there are hotkeys within Windows terminal using which you can actually split screen, and you can close the terminal, that particular window and all that. So there are so many hotkeys within Windows terminal, you can actually go through that. So I'm not going to explain all those things, I mean nitty-gritties, but what I'm going to explain is how do you start these multiple windows at once. So let me just show you what I have done. So as you can see, I have simply written this .bat file, so which has a wt p minus p Ubuntu. That means the first window that you are actually seeing is actually Ubuntu shell. So I'm just saying that using wt minus p Ubuntu, and then the colon is actually to split pane, and then split pane minus p Windows PowerShell. So we're actually splitting pane and then creating another one which is actually Windows PowerShell with a default directory as responsive images. And again there is another split pane for minus p command prompt. So I have actually three windows on the screen, and then minus h minus d and e projects. I mean minus h is actually to horizontal split. So when you do a split pane, it is going to split vertically, and then when you do a minus h, it is actually going to split horizontally. So that is what you can see on my home screen. So you have on the left you have one Ubuntu shell, and then we have vertically split, and then we have a PowerShell, and then we have a horizontal split, and then we have command prompt. And afterwards we have done what we have done is we set a new tab. So new tab minus p Windows PowerShell. So we are asking for a PowerShell in the new tab, and then the default directory is going to be Janus Graph bin. And you can actually focus which tab you wanted to focus by using focus tab minus t is 0. So minus t 0, 0 is the index of the tab. So when we say minus t 0, that means 0th tab is going to be the index. So that is the reason why when my Windows terminal started, it actually starts with this screen on. So this is where I will simply go and then start my Janus graph. So this is how you can use Windows terminal for launching multiple tabs at once, and then you can connect to multiple servers. You can as well do that. So which is very handy, and then I really like Windows terminal the moment I saw it, and I highly encourage you to actually experiment with it, and then if you like it, you can use it because it is free. So you have created your bat file, and then you can actually run it anytime you want, but you might want to have it on your taskbar. So you cannot really drag a bat file directly onto your taskbar. That is not going to work. So you have to create a shortcut for your bat file and append c:\windows explorer.exe to your bat file, something like this. So in your shortcut, you have to actually have the target as c windows explorer.exe, and then within double quotes you can have the complete path of your bat file, and you can configure custom icon for it, and then you can finally drag it onto your taskbar. So that is when it is going to work. Then you can add it to your taskbar and you're good to go. We have covered how to install WSL2, and we have covered Windows Terminal, but we have missed two important topics, which are do I need to install Docker, and what about Linux distributions having Docker by itself, because in my case I'm using Ubuntu. Within Ubuntu I have Docker running, and also I have Docker desktop running in Windows. So how do I integrate between this Docker desktop in Windows and Docker engine running inside my Ubuntu? So these are the questions that we have to answer yet, right? So do I need to install Docker? If that is your question, based upon your needs, I mean based upon your development stack that you are using, if you are using microservices, if you are deploying multiple instances of things, and then you don't want to corrupt your Windows operating system with lots of software installed, then I would encourage you to go for Docker. So you can actually install Docker by using, so this is Docker desktop and WSL2 backend. Now that you have installed WSL2 and you want to install Docker on top of your machine, so these are the set of instructions that you can follow. The prerequisites are you should have installed Windows 10 on your machine, and then with this specific build or higher, and then enable WSL2 feature on Windows. So these are the same requirements for WSL2 as well. And then download and install Linux kernel package, Linux kernel update package you have installed. That is when you can actually install Docker desktop. So you can simply download Docker desktop and then install it. So instructions are pretty straightforward. You don't really need to do much. And then once you have done install your Docker desktop, you can simply restart your machine and then your Docker is set up. So you have to go to your WSL integration, and then you have to actually run this WSL set default distribution name. So this is where you actually set up which Docker instance or which Docker engine you want to connect with your Docker desktop. So that is your default Linux distribution is what you are going to define it here. So you can actually run this command in a PowerShell and then say WSL set default. Your distribution name is Ubuntu. I mean, in my case, it is Ubuntu. You could have done Kali Linux or Debian, or right. So once these steps are complete, then you're all done, and your Docker is set up on your Windows machine. Docker desktop is there, and on your Linux distribution, it is your responsibility to go ahead and then install Docker. So installing Docker inside Ubuntu or installing Docker inside any other Linux distribution, you have enough number of material out there. You can follow any of those materials and you can install Docker in that. So once you have installed Docker and set up your Docker machines and everything, and you can actually run them inside your Linux distribution, and those Docker containers are going to be visible inside your Docker desktop. Let me just show you how I have done. So as I said, inside my oh, this is a classic issue. So it is good we already faced this issue now. In my Windows machine, I have 3 drives: C drive, D drive, and E drive. But when I restarted my machine, most of the cases what happens is my E drive and D drive are not getting mounted in my Linux distribution. This is quite possible, and it can happen because of the mount sequence that is happening inside your Linux distribution. So to solve this problem, you have to restart your LXSS manager, Linux subsystem manager. So you have to stop and then start it, and you will do that by using net commands. So to restart LXSS manager, you have to actually open a command prompt in the administrator mode, and then you can actually run this command net stop LXSS manager. So and then it actually stops the LXSS manager, and subsequently you have to start your LXSS manager, net start LXSS manager. So the service has been started. So once this is done, you will get a pop-up asking for restarting your Docker desktop. So go ahead and do that. So now your Linux distribution is up, and let me just close my Windows terminal, close all tabs, and start my Windows terminal afresh. So when I do this, now I'm going to see my E drive properly mounted. Let me see that. LSMNTE. So now you can see my E drive is properly mounted. Earlier I was just seeing Docker work. So that is my work folder which I have created for mounting. But I mean, as the drive is not mounted, it is not visible. So now MNTE is showing all my working folders, and now I can simply go to sudo, and I can simply go to my cd mnt e drive docker work janus, and I can start my janus graph instance. So here we go, my Docker desktop has started, and you can see my Janus graph is running. So these Janus graph and Cassandra and Elasticsearch containers are actually running inside my Linux distribution, but they are available from Docker desktop, which is actually running inside Windows. So this is the beauty of the integration and having a thin layer of virtualization in Windows using WSL2. Here you can see my Janus graph, Cassandra, and Elasticsearch. All the 3 containers are running, and these containers I can as well start their terminals if I want. So instead of running your docker exec -it commands for opening that container shell, you can simply open your Docker desktop and then open their individual shell prompts. Do I need to install Docker? We have already answered this question. And then what about Linux distributions having their own Docker instance, and then how do we connect between these two? We have already seen that by an example. So next up is the key issues that you face during installation and setup of WSL2. So out of this, one issue we have already seen, the D and E drives not getting mounted when you restart your machine. So this we have already seen. You have to just restart an LXSS manager by using net command. So we have seen that how do you run it. And the next thing is RAM peaking, and which will never come back to normal. So this is quite possible. Why? Because Linux distributions treat free memory differently. So they grab any free memory available and then they actually use it for caching, cache memory. So to solve this problem, all you have to do is write a .wsl config file inside your user's home directory in Windows. So this .wsl config file you have to create. So inside you have to write your .wsl config file, and within that you need to have these three lines, WSL2, and I hope you're able to see this. WSL2, and then memory is equal to 5 GB. You can actually provide it in GB, I mean like 5 GB, 10 GB, 8 GB, whatever amount of RAM you want to dedicate for WSL2. You can actually mention this. It is not that it is going to occupy all the RAM all the time. It is the maximum RAM that you are actually specifying here. Though you are actually saying memory, you are actually giving the maximum RAM that it can occupy while it is running WSL2. So with that, you will be left with your remaining RAM for your Windows operating system and rest of the applications running inside your Windows. So this is one of the important activities that you might want to perform when you are setting up your WSL2. So with that, we have covered key issues, RAM. So thank you guys for bearing with me so far. So we have actually discussed various topics in this sessions, and hope you like this video. And if you like it, please give a thumbs up and like the video, share it with your friends, and keep your digital seekers hat always on. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.